Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. If we talk about Latin American short story writers, some of the names that will come to mind are Jorge Luis Borges, of course, Gabriel García Márquez, maybe Juan Rulfo, Julio Cortázar, Juan José Arreola, so many others, but not many people will tell you about Julio Ramón Ribeyro. And here's the thing, I believe Julio Ramón Ribeyro is a master of the short story. He really stretched the boundaries of the genre by giving voice to the voiceless, as he would say himself, and also by making sure that we were not, going along the beaten path with the typical formulas of the traditional short story. So I have here for you, what I wanted to share with you are some ideas on an English translation of 19 short stories by Ribeyro that were written throughout a period of 40 years, more or less. And what are some characteristics of this collection? I would say, first of all, that it has great thematic amplitude. Okay, you have the fantastic, the quotidian, the local, the universal, all in one place. So that's the first thing that catches my attention about this collection of stories by Ribeyro. You can think about it this way. If García Márquez and Rulfo were attracted to a specific type of setting, and if Julio Cortázar and Jorge Luis Borges dealt primarily with a certain kind of theme or maybe a certain kind of mode, Ribeyro, what he does is, or what he provides for us, is really a unique way of looking at reality. I would say, if somebody asked me what is Ribeyro's trademark as a short story writer, that is what I would say. Let me tell you a little bit about this. Here's the thing. In Spanish, La palabra del mudo, that is the title, was the basically general title that Ribeyro used for the entirety of his short story output. Then, later on, he put together a collection selected by himself, so a personal anthology of sorts, of his best short stories. But here's the thing, he used exactly the same title, La palabra del mudo, so you can imagine the confusion that causes sometimes. And that is, it's a slight problem there. He wrote a total of 9 books of short stories throughout his life. The first one is from 1955. The last one from 1992, and we have here a total of 87 stories, 19 of which are included in this collection, and it really covers his whole life, or his whole career as a short story writer. So the first thing that I wanted to explore when looking at this collection of short stories is this, the variety or the scope that this collection has, which I think is really astonishing. And here's a little experiment that I wanted to recommend that you try if you get your hands on this book. Read the first story in the collection and the last one back to back. That will give you a perfect idea of how varied this collection is. The first story here is titled Tracks. And I really liked it. This was the first one that I read. I read it, chronologically or in the order that they appear here. And I really liked it from the very beginning. In this story, a man finds bloodstains on the ground, and he decides to follow the trail. It may be read as a doppelganger story, but it could also be seen as a parable. One of the ideas of which is that the suffering of others is also our own suffering. And then if you go to the last story, as I said before, the last story is titled Music, Maestro Berenson, and Yours Truly. This one is about a young lover of classical music who meets a European maestro who had traveled to Peru, escaping from the horrors of World War II. So we have 2 very interesting characters here. It's a coming-of-age story. And it's also a story that measures the abyss, really, between ideals and reality. So we have a very interesting theme here, and very, very good characters that you will remember after you're done reading the short story. Let's explore some of the themes or some of the areas that this collection covers, and there are quite a few of them, but the first one that I wanted to touch upon is what I call the Kafka connection. Okay, stories dealing with guilt, shame, fear. So you know what I mean by the Kafka connection? It's that kind of thing. And the first one that that caught my attention was the story titled Out at Sea. And before I go on, let me say this now because I'm going to forget. This edition has an introduction by Alejandro Zambra. So the introduction is really, really good. So it's it's an added pleasure to that. So as I said before, the story Out at Sea. Okay, in this story, plot is not really the main thing. The main thing here is a certain mood or a certain state of mind that the characters experience. And basically the plot or the idea of the story, the premise, is that a man anticipates an acquaintance's revenge on him. So there's that tension to it. I see this story as a response to Edgar Allan Poe's The Cask of Amontillado, that classic story. But this one, Out at Sea, I would say is the other side of the coin. Because if you remember, in The Cask of Amontillado, we have a story that has no beginning and that focuses on the man who is taking revenge. In this story by Ribeyro, we have a story that has no ending and that focuses on the man who is racked with guilt. So you have that kind of reversal right here. And there are many stories about shame, okay, and I want to mention 3 of them. One of them is titled Meeting of Creditors. The other one is The Substitute Teacher. And then finally we have A Nocturnal Adventure. The last one I thought was the best of these 3 stories about shame. A Nocturnal Adventure. I think it's the most effective. In this story, a young man sees a woman smiling at him from inside a cafe. That is the premise. And, Kafka was very familiar and he knew very well the territory of broken dreams. Ribeyro does too. Okay, this is a territory that he explores very well. Another story that deals with this kind of, this realm, if we can call it that, or that takes place in this kind of a setting, of a spiritual or psychological setting, is a story that you can find here titled Barbara. This is a story about frustrated desire, about a couple who is divided by language. Okay, so it has a very bizarre climax. I do remember that. So very memorable too. A really, really interesting comment on the nature of language. Let's move on to another topic, and that is the topic of solitude. I remember hearing that Garcia Marquez said that solitude was the only topic, the only theme that he explored in his entire body of work, which I think is quite an assertion. Ribeyro does it very well too. Okay, you have a story like The First Snowfall. It's a story about codependency in which a poet takes over a man's house. Okay, and it points to a very sad truth, which is that some people will take humiliation before loneliness. Some people would much rather be humiliated than be lonely. And that is one of the themes of this story, The First Snowfall by Ribeyro. Another story that also looks at solitude is titled Silvio in El Rosedal. Silvio is a young man who inherits an estate, a property called El Rosedal. And at one point he becomes convinced that the roses in his garden spell out a word in Morse code. So the question is he reading too much into things? Are we reading too much into things when we read literature? There's that connection right there. There's a sense of an ominous fate also hanging on him, this idea of the inevitable. When it comes to that, I thought of Edgar Allan Poe's story Metzengerstein, this idea that there's something that you cannot escape, kind of a fate, hanging over the character. So a very interesting tale too. Let's look at another area, okay, and that is the fantastic vein. There's a fantastic vein to so many Latin American authors, and Ribeyro here is no exception. There's a story titled Doubled. Okay, this one really stands out, but let me ask you this. How many doppelganger stories have you read? That is exactly my point. Okay, you would think that this is a topic that has been done to death, okay, but Ribeyro really does it very well. This one, Doubled, it may seem cliche to write a doppelganger story, but I am fascinated by doppelganger stories, and this is one of the best that I have ever read. Another story, The Insignia. Oh my God. Okay, if you read one story from this book, make it The Insignia. It's about a man who finds a very mysterious emblem and he decides to start wearing it, and it traces the consequences of that. That's all I'm going to say. I mean, just read the story because it's really something else, and it was one of my favorite for sure. Another story dealing with a fantastic kind of a topic or a theme is titled Ritter and the Paperweight. It's about a guy who finds, this guy's from Lima, right? And he finds in Belgium a paperweight that he threw out the window in Peru. It's very, very interesting stuff going on here. Another has a very nice title. It's titled Nothing to be Done, Monsieur Baruch. Okay, and it really it's a fantastic story because it relates the last moments in the life of a man who committed suicide from the perspective of the man who committed suicide. And in this one, look out for a cameo appearance by Ribeyro himself. And finally, the last fantastic story that I wanted to mention has a title in Latin. Okay, and my Latin is a little bit rusty, but I'm going to do my best here. It's titled Nuit Caprense Sirius Illuminata. Okay, this one is about the reunion of two old lovers, and it's ambiguous because the beloved may not exist, or she may be two women at the same time. So we really have a very unusual story here with this one. Let's move on to another little topic or little area that Ribeyro covers, and that is creative nonfiction. Believe it or not, we do have examples of that. You can see this is a very, very ample collection that we have here. There's a story titled The Wardrobe, Old Folks and Death. And in this one, an immense wardrobe, which is a family heirloom, is the pride of the narrator's father. So it's really a meditation on that, you know, how creative fiction is. And another one that I thought was really good was For Smokers Only, in which Ribeyro tells us basically what the role of cigarettes has been in his life and also in his literary career. With these stories, you feel as if Ribeyro is inviting you to his personal life. It's really nice, and it's a really nice place to be. So I really enjoyed the creative nonfiction included in this collection. There are also stories about writers, okay, like A Literary Tea Party. That is one of them. It's a light farce in which a group of snobs is waiting for a writer to arrive. They're going to have a meeting with him. And also the story titled The Solution also deals with a writer. You don't really hear the story, but you hear a writer describing the story that he is currently writing. It's about a man who suspects that his wife is being unfaithful to him, and he plots revenge in this story that he is writing at the moment. I see a Cortázar connection here when it comes to stories about writers, and it's this. One thing that both Cortázar and Ribeyro understood is that great literature has much to gain by not taking itself seriously. If you know Cortázar, for Cortázar literature was a game. For Ribeyro, I wouldn't say the same thing, but I would say that both of them understood that at times you had to be a little bit funny. You had to leave the seriousness aside in order to produce something worthwhile. And then I have one more story to go. There's only one that I have not mentioned, and I thought this one deserved a separate segment. It's titled At the Foot of the Cliff. It's a magnificent story about a man and his two sons who live at the beach. They build a house there, okay, and they make a precarious living just out of hard work and ingenuity. So you have a very nice setting, very nice characters, a very nice situation here. And the protagonist faces loss. He also faces humiliation or antagonism from figures of authority. It's really a story about the least fortunate. One of the images that stood out to me, the narrator compares the poor to a plant called the higuerilla, or higuerilla, if you want me to lose my Argentine accent. It's a tree that grows in the worst places, under the least propitious circumstances, it will grow, right? So this story is really a testimony to the stoicism and the resilience of the least fortunate. And it features, I would say, Ribeyro at his most compassionate, humanistic, heartbreaking, but also hopeful. So it's important to keep in mind that there is a sense of hope always in the work of Ribeyro, at least in most of the stories that I encountered in this volume. Let me talk briefly, just 2 words about the translation. This collection, which is published by New York Review Books, was translated by Katherine Silver. She translated Cesar Aira's The Literary Conference. I'm sorry, I got confused because the title in Spanish is El Congreso de Literatura. She also translated a little book that I absolutely love, which is Martín Adán also a Peruvian writer. His novel, I would say, The Cardboard House, La Casa de Cartón. So, and more recently, she also translated Juan Carlos Onetti's collected stories. This one, I loved it. Okay, and let me confess this. I read Ribeyro first in English. This was the first book that I read by Ribeyro. Like literally this book here. I mean, I had read Doblaje, Doubled, in Spanish before, but it was only that short story. This was really my introduction to Ribeyro in English, and I absolutely fell in love with this author. So this is a really, really good translation. Do you want to read him in Spanish, though? Okay, so Alfaguara published his collected or his complete short stories many years ago in one of those huge volumes like the one they have for, let's see, I have the one for Cortázar, Onetti, Folkwill, and Arreola. Okay, so they were very large books that most of the time include. There was one with Benedetti's stories also, but that is unfortunately out of print. It's a little bit expensive. It's difficult to come by. What you do find in Spanish is the collection that Ribeyro put of his own short stories, his own personal selection, titled also La Palabra del Mudo. So that one is readily available. And then there's another one published by Austral. It's an anthology. Okay, so they have this one. It has 26 stories versus 19 in the one in English. There are some that you can find in the one in English, some of my favorite actually, that are not included here, and vice versa. And they claim that this is about 1/3 of Ribeiro's output as a short story writer. So that's a nice volume that is easy to find, that you can also, get if you are able to read Spanish and you want to experience Ribeyro in the original. Okay, so there are some authors like, I don't know, Clarice Lispector, like Julio Cortázar, like Tarjei Vesos, who are just a pleasure to discover. And I would include Ribeyro on that list. I would say he's one of those authors that you're like, wow, why had I not read him before? I wish I had encountered him before. That was my reaction to him. So if you have not read Ribeyro yet, you have no idea how I envy you, okay? Because there's nothing like that first encounter. This is something that I've probably said before. I know I've said it before in person to many people, so I may have mentioned this in a previous video. That first encounter, that first experience of entering the world's, the world of an author is simply something that you cannot repeat, no matter how much you reread and all that, So I hope you will give Ribeyro a chance. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just keep them coming because I absolutely love them. Thank you so much for stopping by and have a wonderful day.